This mode contains 3 sub-modes for playing instruments on the current track. Here's a quick example of the basic functionality of this mode. The sub-modes of this mode will automatically be selected based on the contents of the current track. If the track contains a drum rack, the drum rack sub-mode will be selected. If the track contains a simpler in slicing mode, the simpler sub-mode will be selected. Otherwise, the scale sub-mode will be selected. All of these sub-modes include some of the same functionalities, so we'll take a look at that first. The left and right arrow buttons will navigate between tracks. And notice that as you navigate between tracks, the current track will be automatically armed. The up and down buttons will move between octaves or selections. In the case of a drum rack, these will move the drum rack selector up and down. Pressing both of these will revert to the default octave or selector position. The matrix accessory buttons are used for note repeat. By default, when the matrix is set up to play instruments, pressing a button will just produce a single note. When note repeat is turned on, pressing a button will produce a stream of continuous rhythmic notes. And this functionality is all accessed via the matrix accessory buttons. The topmost button will turn note repeat on or off. When pressed quickly, this will toggle note repeat on or off. And when held down, it functions as a momentary switch. The rest of these buttons control the rate, and these range from a quarter note up to a 30-second note. Triplet rates are also accessible. When shift is held down, these select the amount of swing to apply to the repeated notes. When used with a controller that has less than 8 matrix accessory buttons, the triplet rates will not be available. These sub-modes also share some additional functionality that you may be able to access. If the controller has additional modifier buttons, you'll be able to access some additional functionality. When quantize is held down, pressing a button will quantize the notes associated with that button. When delete is held down, pressing a button will delete or erase the notes associated with the button. If the clip is playing, holding down a button will erase the notes that the playhead is passing over. If the clip is not playing, this will just delete all the notes. And finally, all of this functionality supports ranges. This sub-mode is identical to the scale mode from the general instrument mode pack, with the exception of some additions on the settings page. If an audio clip is selected, pressing this button will create a new track with a simpler containing the audio clip. And if simpler exists on the track, pressing this button will toggle between simpler's modes. This sub-mode splits the matrix into 4 quadrants of pads for playing drum racks. When used with a matrix that has less than 8 rows, you'll just have 2 quadrants of pads to work with. If the matrix has RGB LEDs, you can choose the LED colors to use. For example, you can choose the LED color to use for pads that are muted. You can also create associations between drum rack pad names or portions of their names and LED colors. I've got some example associations here. Any pad with kick in its name will be blue. Any pad with snare or clap in its name will be white. And any pad with hat or HH in its name will be magenta. Here's what that looks like on the Launchpad Pro. All my kicks are blue, my snares and claps are white, my hi-hats are magenta, and all other pads are yellow. If the controller has a mute modifier button, when it's held down, you can mute drum rack pads. If the controller has a solo modifier button, when it's held down, you can solo drum rack pads. And if the controller has a select modifier, when it's held down, you can unsolo all drum rack pads and unmute all drum rack pads. This sub-mode sets up the matrix to play slices in simpler. When Shift is held down, you can access simpler settings. On the top row, the first two buttons control the start marker. The last two buttons control the end marker. In both cases, if you press both buttons, it'll reset the start or end marker. The two buttons in the center control different settings depending on the slicing style that's selected. When transients is selected, these will control the sensitivity. In all cases, pressing both of these will revert the setting to its default value. This button controls the trigger mode. Right now that's set to trigger. This button will reverse the sample. The buttons in the center select the slicing style to use, which dictates the setting that these buttons will control. When beats is selected, these buttons choose the subdivision to use. When regions is selected, these buttons select how many regions to use. When manual is selected, these buttons have no function. We'll take a look at the manual slicing style in just a minute. This button will toggle between Simpler's main modes. This button will play the selected slice. The buttons in the center will nudge the selected slice's marker backwards or forwards. Nudging is only accessible in the transients and manual slicing styles. To give you an example of how these work, as you can see, the second slice is a bit late, so I can nudge that back a bit. The third slice is a bit late too, so I'll nudge that back as well. This button will reset all slice markers. This button will delete all slice markers. And again, this is only accessible in the transients and manual slicing styles. It's useful for when you want to create your own slices via pad slicing. This button here will turn pad slicing on, and I'll give you an example of how that works. I simply play the sample and press pads to create new slices. Some of the slices I created aren't very useful. For example, this slice here. So I can use this button to delete that slice. These buttons here control the playback mode. These buttons control warping. This button will essentially double the speed of the sample. This button will essentially cut the speed of the sample in half. And finally, this button will trigger warp as.